Good afternoon, everybody. Is this microphone doing what it needs to do? Yeah? Got to get right into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. The Forum is an initiative of the Humanities Program, which brings speakers, scholars, authors, journalists, experts from around the country and around the world to campus to talk about their areas of expertise. And it gives you a chance, or sort of the whole Providence College community, a chance to come together and encounter new ideas, new perspectives, to deepen our appreciation for the humanities in a non-classroom setting. So even though here we are in a classroom, we're doing something that's entirely different, or somewhat different. Let me tell you briefly what to expect today, and then I'm going to relinquish this microphone. So our guest will be speaking for about 45 minutes, after which there's Q&A. And then at 4:45, we'll call it a day, and there's a reception next door in the Fiandella Great Room. So with that knowledge you now have comes certain responsibilities. The first, which affects you during the talk, is to close down those laptop screens. Because they're distracting, because you got pencils and paper, because you don't have to memorize this. It'll all be on YouTube next week. You're good. So that's the first thing. The second thing is during the Q&A, you, student, have to ask the first question. Professors are expressly forbidden from asking the first question. So we're going to sit here in silence until somebody says, I got something I want to know more about. And the last rule is you should really head next door. There's a lot of great food there. And just, say hi to each other and get your weekend off to a high caloric start. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Father Isaac Morales, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Today's forum is co-sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Fellowship, of which I am a director, and in case you haven't heard about it, it's an initiative that we have under the Humanities Program that promotes the teaching of the writings and thought of C.S. Lewis. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Junius Johnson is a writer, teacher, speaker, independent scholar, and musician. His work focuses on beauty, imagination, and wonder, and how these are at play in the Christian and classical intellectual traditions. He is the executive director of Junius Johnson Academics, through which he offers innovative classes for both children and adults that aim to ignite student hearts. They're human too, right? I hope, anyway. Human student hearts with wonder and intellectual rigor. An avid devotee of story, he is especially drawn to fantasy, science fiction, and young adult fiction. He performs professionally on the French horn and electric bass. And he holds a BA in English literature from Oral Roberts University, an MAR in historical theology from Yale Divinity School, numerous graduate degrees from Yale University, including his doctorate in philosophical theology. He is the author of 5 books, and he is the co-host of the Classical Mind podcast and is a member of the Cultivating Project. His most recent book, I believe, is called On Teaching Fairy Stories. And so today, he's going to give us a talk with the title, Fairies, Angels, and the Human Heart, Nature and Supernature in Conversation. Please join me in welcoming Junius Johnson.
Testing. Okay, yes. Can you hear me? Good. Okay, look, it's Friday afternoon. I know that. I am tired. I've been working all day. So I'm going to try to keep myself awake, and hopefully that will also help to keep you awake. If not, just don't tell me about it. Just nod off peacefully and unobtrusively. I would first like to thank Dr. Ian Bernhoff and Father Isaac Morales for their interest in my work and for bringing me here today. It is a joy to get to talk to you of these matters and to hear your reactions. Never take for granted doing what you love. So to begin with, I'm talking about fairies. You know that. So you guys are automatically cool because you came here to talk about fairies. And to get started, I wanted to just look at where fairies came from. And what I mean by where they came from is, I don't mean how did humans first think up the idea of fairies. I mean, according to people who believe that fairies are real, where do they think these things come from, right? And so there are a few different accounts of fairy origins. The first one is that they are fallen angels. They're angels who chose to leave heaven when Satan rebelled. And so they went with Satan, and they're like, cool, okay, we're off on our own. What are we going to do? And Satan's like, we're going to attack God. And they're like, no, that's too far. And so depending on how the story goes, in one version of the story, God kind of got annoyed that all the people were leaving heaven. It was kind of depopulating. And so he was like, okay, that's it. We're done. Nobody can move. Everybody stays put where you are. And so the demons were in hell, and the angels were in heaven, and the fairies kind of got stuck in the middle. And so they became fairies. So in other words, they're kind of like the angels in Canto 3 of Inferno, who So, as I was saying, remember in Canto 3 of the Inferno where there were these angels who didn't declare for either God or Satan, and so they wound up kind of stuck in limbo. They weren't being punished, and they weren't being rewarded. That's kind of where these one sense of where the fairies might come from is. So obviously then they would be of immense power because they have angelic being, but they would also be of dubious morality because they're like neither good enough for heaven nor bad enough for hell. This account was probably attractive to Puritans who wanted to fit the fairies, if they were willing to allow them any existence at all, into the biblical structure of the universe, a structure that makes no claims to being exhaustive and that even occasionally hints at the opposite. But it's not very good for our purposes, right? I think that the types of fairies that wind up going into the stories, they don't really make a lot of sense this way. Robin Goodfellow doesn't make much sense as a fallen angel. So then the next theory is that fairies are spirits of the dead. And this is very strong in many of the old folk legends about them, especially in Ireland. And there's a gentleman called Pierre de Loyer, who in 1605 connected the conception of fairies to Roman belief in the ancestral spirits, the Lares. And so what's funny about this is the Romans, your grandmother would die, and then you would bury her like in the house, and so there's like grandma's grave over there in the kitchen. And so there was a strong sense that she was still with you and approving or disapproving, probably disapproving of what you were doing. And so you had to be respectful to her memory and whatnot, and this turned into a kind of ancestor worship among the Romans that continued alongside of their other religion. And it's sometimes another idea that often developed around this was that maybe, the servants that you had in your house, because you're that kind of person, they die working for you, and maybe their spirits hang out around your house. And so your house is kind of haunted by the dead spirits of your former servants/slaves. Probably not a great comforting thought, and that fits in well with the fairy tradition because generally speaking, you don't want to see a fairy. It's bad news, right? You call them the good people because they don't like to be called fairies, and if you say the name, they're going to notice, and you don't want them to come around. Whichever the case with this spirits of the dead tradition, they partake of that ambiguous attitude towards the living that may shortly be described as envy. They long for what we have, and they hate us for having it. And from this comes their tendency to troublemaking, which extends from mischief all the way to cruelty and bodily harm. Some versions of this tradition convert limbo into the fairy state, so now not the angels but humans who were neither good enough for heaven nor bad enough for hell wind up becoming fairies after their death, doomed to walk the earth, gradually fading over time until they no longer exist. So that's another tradition. Now this next one's really fun. Some people thought that fairies were children of Eve. And the story goes that God was coming to visit Eve, and like a good guest, he sent notice ahead. Hey, Thursday, I'm going to come and visit. And so Eve is cleaning the house and trying to put things in order, and she's got loads of children. And some of them she's ashamed of for whatever reason. Sometimes it's because they're ugly or because they're weird or whatever the thing is about them. She's not. Every family's got one, that uncle. And so what she decides to do is she says, I'm going to hide these from God so that he doesn't see my weird kids. And so she hides the bad ones in a cave, and then the rest of them are there. And she's like, look, Lord, look at my beautiful children. And he's like, yeah, they're great. Where are the rest of them? And she's like, what do you mean, Lord? And he's like, seriously? We're doing this again? Like, I'm God. I know what's going on. So he cursed the ones that she hid to become fairies, which seems like hard luck for them. They didn't do anything wrong. I think the key here, and this is actually really interesting, is that in that case, they represent a branching in the history of rational species in the world. Right? They are related to us as children of Eve and presumably also Adam, because like who else was there? But they have an entirely different history and have managed to preserve the old ways. They do not seem to have had their length of days reduced, as we did in Genesis 6:3. They presumably survived the flood due to their own craft, not the intervention of God through an ark, although who's not to say that there wasn't another fairy ark floating on the other side of the world. They are undiminished and so rightly called an elder race. According to this view, it is easy to see that fairies should be, like humans, spiritual animals. That is, a union of spirit and body. And if they seem higher than humans in all things, it must be stated to the contrary that they have had no incarnation, no redeemer, despite the fact that they, like us, are the offspring of sinful forebears. And therefore, because they do presumably share in the fall of Adam and Eve, but do not presumably share in the salvation of Christ, their spiritual destiny is dubious. In this connection, it is perhaps interesting that they are called children of Eve, where humans are more normally called children of Adam. We cannot say if they have any share in the work of the second Adam. And then the last theory of where fairies come from, last tradition, is that they are the old gods, chthonic gods, nature spirits. Yeats, W.B. Yeats, reports the notion common in Ireland that the fairies are ancient gods of the deep places of the earth. He says, quote, many poets and all mystic and occult writers in all ages and countries have declared that behind the visible are chains on chains of conscious beings who are not of heaven, but of the earth, who have no inherent form, but change according to their whim, or the mind that sees them. You cannot lift your hand without influencing and being influenced by hordes. The visible world is merely their skin. In dreams, we go among them and play with them and combat with them. They are perhaps human souls in the crucible, these creatures of whim. Boy, that Yeats could write. Here we get the sense of great antiquity. Their powers are older than our race, coeval with the mountains and the seas, the moor and the forests. They must look upon us as we look upon the animals. And if we don't hesitate to enclose the animals in zoos to live their lives simply for our pleasure at looking at them, or to hunt them because it gives us a thrill, well, this is exactly the sort of disregard and reckless abandon with which the fairies so often treat the humans that come under their notice in the tales. Each of these views presents certain problems for attempts to integrate fairies positively into a theological account of the world. The least problematic, perhaps, is the account that makes them the children of Eve, because in that case, it may be that since the second Adam is the seed of Eve, they may be folded into the ranks of those who may be rightly preached to, whom we may expect to see rising at the great day to meet their Lord and ours in the air. And if we also remember that the great Virgin Mary is the second Eve, then that may make it even easier to fold them into that story. So that works, but that's not the way the tradition has gone. There's an actual human history here to how these guys are talked about and thought about, and that's not how it went. Deeply influenced by the other accounts that I gave you, which place them squarely outside of the works of God, the fairies show a clear aversion to the works of salvation. Their special enemy is John the Baptist, the forerunner of the Redeemer. That's funny, right? Oh no, John the Baptist, run! St. John's wort, a midsummer flower named for the Baptist, is poison to them. And the feast of St. John the Baptist, coming on Midsummer's Day, breaks the fairy power which peaks on Midsummer's Eve. In the clearest image of the notion that fairies cannot have any traffic with Christian salvation, baptism protects a baby from being changed with a changeling. They can't steal your baby and replace it with a fairy bomb if your baby's been baptized. So don't delay, get those kids baptized. Well, and besides aversion to everything to do with baptism, the Midsummer's Eve is famously like fairy time, right? Shakespeare wrote a whole play about it. But they have another big time too, and that's midwinter, because it's the solstices, right? Do you guys remember what night of the year, what else happens on Midwinter's Eve? Christmas Eve, right? So their midwinter power is broken by the feast of the birth of Christ, as midwinter night gives way to mid-Christmas morning. And they cannot stand the Rowan tree, which is a special ward against evil creatures and powers. Okay, so given all of this, it is quite natural that the response of Christian priests to the fairy tradition was largely to try to suppress it as superstitious nonsense at best and dangerous fascination with dark powers at worst. It stank of residual paganism, and indeed, this is probably the source of these tales, which breathe the same air as the gods of Asgard. And so I might simply pose the rather stinging question, what has Jerusalem to do with Fairyland? And dismiss this matter out of hand, and we could end the talk here and I'll go have a very nice dinner. So thank you for inviting me in. Except for one tiny little thing. Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton says, quote, "Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense." And he also says, the goodness of the fairy tale was not affected by the fact that there might be more dragons than princesses. It was good to be in a fairy tale. Lewis speaks of them having the power to, quote, steal past those watchful dragons of religious inhibition. In Tolkien, the funnel through which so much of the older fantasy tradition passed into the contemporary mind, says that it is in the encounter with the Fae, Fairy, encounter with the Fae that humans are rendered sub-creators. How can they say these things? Because, like all good things, fairies refuse to stay put. What was true of them in their original conception and in their use in folklore does not determine what the future course of their literary use will be. And so I shall have to finish the talk after all. Oh, nope. I'm done. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Trying to get out of here. I want to talk not about where the idea of fairies began, but about where it can take us. But I will warn you, no path through Fairyland is straight. And so my path cannot be either. But if you stick with me, we'll get through it all right. Okay, so nature and supernature, situating fairies. I have all these headings for the talk that I just have to say them because I didn't work them into the prose. So first I want to talk about the nature of nature and supernature. There's a temptation to identify the natural with the physical, and that's going to have to be resisted. We often assume the immateriality of supernature as well. This is not going to work. Okay, so first of all, just because something is natural doesn't mean it's material. Can I give you an example? Okay, sure. Thoughts. Your thoughts are not physical, I don't think. I think all the science that tries to describe them as emergent properties of physical beings has got a lot more work to do before it's even coherent, much less compelling. Right? So just because something's natural doesn't mean it's physical. And we're also super confident that we know that the supernatural is non-physical or immaterial. But, contrary to that, consider this unfortunately lengthy passage from Lewis's novel Out of the Silent Planet. He says, "The swiftest thing that touches our senses is light. We do not truly see light, we only see slower things lit by it. So that for us, light is on the edge, the last thing we know before things become too swift for us. But the body of an Eldil," that's angels, "is a movement as swift as light. You may say its body is made of light, but not of that which is light for the Eldil. his light is a swifter movement, which for us is nothing at all. And what we call light is for him a thing like water, a visible thing, a thing he can touch and bathe in, even a dark thing when not illuminated by the swifter. And what we call firm things, flesh and earth, seem to him thinner and harder to see than our light, and more like clouds and nearly nothing. To us, the Eldil is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself, he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like cloud. And what is true light to him and fills the heaven so that he will plunge into the rays of the sun to refresh himself from it is to us the black nothing in the sky at night. That guy can write too. Man, you guys' books are fun. So he's imagining angels as having bodies, but bodies of a higher sort than anything we know in the natural world. I do not at this time argue for this, but it does call into question the easy assumption that the spiritual is necessarily immaterial or bodiless. Okay, so I can't divide nature and supernature on the basis of physical and non-physical or something like that. So instead, how am I going to divide them? Well, a better distinction is to think about it this way. They're separate orders whose distinction is best observed from their history. That the supernatural is a separate order is clear from the fact that it was not affected by the fall of humanity. The angels do not live in a world damaged by sin, and the sinfulness of the demons predates our fall. Otherwise, how could they tempt us? All nature fell in Adam, but supernature was not in play. Okay? I know that's not a definition, that's a characterization. Maybe I'll make it clearer what the difference is a little bit later on, but for now, you're going to have to deal with that. So, okay, we've got these two distinct realms that are following their own course. What's their relationship between each other? How are we going to conceive of that? What is nature to do with supernature? Well, here's a thesis, the great divide, right? Nature cannot transcend itself. Supernature remains beyond nature's ability to lay hold of. So if you think, okay, I'm going to climb up above nature and arrive at supernature, I can pull myself up by the bootstraps, a sort of spiritual version of the American dream. Nope. So perhaps we ought to say that they're disconnected and discontinuous. In the same way that Lewis, when he talks about worlds, he'll say that, this is in The Magician's Nephew, Uncle Andrew reveals that the dust in the box out of which he made the rings came from another world. And he says, I don't mean another planet. Other planets are part of this world, and you could get to them if you went far enough. I mean another world, someplace you could never get to no matter how far you traveled. So maybe supernature and nature are that sort of a thing. There's a discontinuity between them, and you need magic rings or divine power to get between them. Except that supernature can cross that divide and visit nature. And this perfects rather than destroys nature. Okay, so that's not helping at all. Let's try this way. Let's take another approach. Let's talk about humans, right? You might like humans? Yeah? I like them. If you don't, we have Loveland counseling services on campus. Okay, so there's a yearning in humanity for transcendence. In spite of the fact that humans are the union of body and soul, that does not make us the union of the natural and the supernatural. For human souls are also natural. How can I prove that? Subject to the fall. Subject to the fall. So once again, natural things are not only physical things. And yet, we humans have a supernatural destiny. At the very least, to be embedded in the supernatural by the union of love with our beloved God at the end of the ages. But possibly also something very much more. The new heavens and new earth may be a taking up of nature into the realm of supernature, a promotion that doesn't do violence to it or imply that it was not good, but that rather fulfills the potential built into it, and so perfects it in this elevation and promotion. If this is so, humans will not be the only natural creatures to benefit from this promotion. Mountains, seas, and planets will become unimaginably more than they ever were or could be in the old order. And yet it is uniquely humanity that can theorize about this possibility, that can hear the distant echoes of the possibility of it, that can yearn for it to be more than an impossible dream. All nature declares the glory of God, but in humans, all nature longs for union with God. So then, if there is a divide, it's temporary, to be overcome at the final elevation of nature. But is there a divide, actually? There can be no doubt that there is something of a separation or quarantine zone, but how are we to account for it? Well, the history of the natural offers no shortage of examples of the supernatural crossing over. See the Bible. And so there's no difficulty with the supernatural coming to the natural. I would submit that the divide is simply an expression of the limits of natural powers. We can no more attain the supernatural through natural means than an ant could attain to human culture through formic means. Formic is the adjective for ant. And yet there is no great divide between humans and ants, except in abstract ideals, such as the classing of different types of causal powers. I may at my leisure destroy ant societies, and ants may at their leisure crawl upon my hand. But such an ant has no idea of the nature of what he is traversing. See what I did there? It's kind of a pun, the nature. That physical whole to which the hand belongs, the soul that gives it life, the great world of human culture and interconnectedness to which it belongs, the eternity with which it has been invested. All of these things are oblivious. The ant's oblivious, right? He could be walking on a rock or a hand. It's all the same to him. In a like manner, the natural rests upon the supernatural, is penetrated by it in its every minutest particle of being, and yet is as unaware of it as the ant on my hand. Okay, so where then do we place fairies in all of this nonsense? The traditions are ambiguous on this point. If they are fallen angels or old gods, they are supernatural. If they are Eve's children, the spirits of the dead, or the spirits of nature, they are natural. They wield powers greater than humans, who are thought to be the pinnacle of the natural world, but their powers pale before the truly supernatural powers of angels and demons. They have their own spaces in history, yet they are subject to the dynamics of human salvation history, because if they weren't, the tokens of human salvation wouldn't affect them negatively. Ellen Kushner is a novelist who wrote a novel called Thomas the Rhymer, which is about this great tradition of a harper who gets kidnapped by the fairy queen and spends 7 years in Fairyland. And here's another, if you thought the last passage was too long, just wait. This is from that novel. Speaking of the Queen of Fairyland, her sharp fingers twisted my head so that I was looking out past the trees to where a path led down into a valley, the sort of rough path a woodman makes to mark his trail, through a dense thicket of brambles with barely room on either side for a body's 2 arms. It twisted down, dark and treacherous, and the briars looked fierce. "Shall we walk that road together, you and I?" the elf queen asked me, and waited for my answer. "Lady," I said, "I doubt even one of us could manage down it." "Clever boy, you speak truer than you know. But what of this one?" She turned my head again. This time it was a proper road, broad and well kept, with room for a good pair of carts or even a company of horses. It wound pleasantly through the grass of a glade. "Where does it go?" I asked. "Where do you think it goes?" "Nowhere to interest us," I said. It had that over-tended look, like one of the king's deer hunting parks, where there may be no stones left for a horse to stumble on, and people ride mostly to show off their new clothes. "Good," she said. "And this?" The breath almost left my body then. There was no road at all, only a great sweep of valley and hillside, all misty silver blue and green. As I gazed, the mist parted to show me a tiny road of ivory winding through forest, field, and stream, all the way up to a distant castle etched stretched fine against the hilltop. A strange joy filled me then. I felt that I was coming home. It was the place I had always sung of, the vision that filled my eyes when I closed them to sing. I never dared to think it could be real for me. Okay, so the first two roads put the reader in mind of the narrow, difficult path to salvation and the broad, easy road to hell. The road to Fairyland is no one of them. It is a third path with its own character. In this tale, the Elf Queen has no traffic with heaven or hell. If Thomas were to choose either of the other paths, he would be lost to her. At the end of his life, he passes where she cannot follow to take the one of the two roads he has been choosing in life. She is outside the dynamics of salvation and the final divine judgments. So, because of all of these reasons, for my part, I think the accent rightly falls on the natural. This is the meaning of the belief that they are the gods of the natural places. They are not supernatural, they are hypernatural. What I mean is they're not something other than nature. They're the densest expressions of nature. They are intense condensations of the power of nature. They can do more than humans because they represent the kind of power we forfeited when we fell. For in our sin, we damaged our natural powers, causing them to run interference with each other and become less effective. They are above us because we have fallen, even though they remain below us in their destiny. And they remain, therefore, incapable of attaining to supernature on their own. Tolkien says this: fairy stories as a whole have three faces: the mystical towards the supernatural, the magical towards nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards man. Well, this shows the location of the fairy quite clearly. It is lower than the supernatural, and so must look up to it in mysticism. It acts with lordly authority towards all nature, which is below it, and so it displays stupendous powers. It looks down on humans precisely as those who have fallen, and offers pity or scorn, depending on whether it looks in a kindly or dismissive fashion. Tolkien goes on to say the essential face of fairy is the middle one, the magical. He makes its relation to nature its essential relation. But we can put that threefold face to greater use, because even the fairy is not without relation to the supernatural, and therefore is not outside of the soul's journey to God. So this next portion is called From Fairyland to Heaven, Finding a Path Upwards. All right, so there's a problem with thinking about the supernatural. I don't know if you've ever encountered this before. I can tell you that an angel is a spiritual being, simple, meaning not composed of parts, and immortal. That although it must always be located in some specific place, possessing no body, its presence in that space does not exclude other beings from also being in that space. So, somebody tell me, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Dominicans. All of them. Because the presence of one doesn't take up the space, and so they don't keep each other out the way that we do. So, however many angels there are can dance on the head of the pin. That's why that question is fun. It's not this random, weird thing that scholastic people like to do because they were bored and didn't have TV. It helps to reveal something really cool about the nature of angels. Okay, so I can tell you all that stuff, but by the way, that's all conjecture. It has more to do with Greek metaphysics than with revealed doctrine. There's not like a book of the Bible that's like, oh, and by the way, angels are. We have no words, experiences, or concepts not born of our dual nature as physical and spiritual. Therefore, all of our words, experiences, and concepts are indelibly marked by the physical. The truth is that we cannot even assess how good or bad an approximation our understanding of angels is, because we fundamentally do not know the degree of analogy that holds between natural and supernatural being, nor the direction of the analogy. For example, in what ways are natural and supernatural being alike and unlike? I don't know. So, for instance, do we really know what Jesus means when he tells the woman at the well that God is spirit? The Westminster Catechism states that, quote, God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Yeah, that's all true. It is clear from what follows that spirit is taken to mean abstraction from bodiliness and physicality. This is fairly characteristic of Christian teaching. But I, for one, am not sure why we are so sure that this is what spirit means. Like, do we know that? But okay, let's grant it for a second. Let's assume that spirit really is not bodily, not physical in any sort of way. Surely, at the very least, that's only the barest intimation of what spirit is, right? If God is the spirit, then surely spirit is not primarily a lack, especially not the lack of something, physicality, that was created after spirit is meant to have existed from all eternity past. And so while we can, and I think should, theorize about the spiritual world, heaven, hell, and their denizens, the whole project is mired in fundamental aporia, an ability to find a road forward, because we cannot know just how badly we're getting things wrong. It is not so with the Fae. For the fairies in their realm, while above the level of the human, and especially the fallen human, is nevertheless natural. Therefore, even though the Fae exceeds all that we have experience of, and is born of deeper interaction with the possibilities of the world than we had ever suspected, it is nevertheless co-natural with us. It's built of the same fundamental rules and materials as the world from which we draw our words, experiences, and concepts. So, while there is still a residue of uncertainty about the degree and directionality of analogy, we can be confident not only that there is an analogy, but that it is strong, no more distant than that which holds between us and the lowliest insensate physical things, which is rather a lot, actually. Look at science, right? The physical sciences, you can do a lot of work in seeing commonalities between humans and other things in our world. Fairyland is the land of attainably more, the land where everything exceeds our imagination without being inaccessible to it. The land where our reason fails, not because it is boggled by the immensity of being of the object, but because it has not yet been schooled in the rules of this corner of reality. It's like going to a foreign country. You don't know what's rude and what's not, how you should act, when do they cross the road? But on the other hand, and so on the one hand, Fairyland demonstrates that there are no universal constants in the natural world. For the laws of behavior, physics, causality, and logic itself are not there what they are here. This is not because it is another world, but because our world is bigger than we ever thought, and then we are constantly tempted to think, and then we ever dare dream. But on the other hand, Fairyland is the proper playground for the imagination. All the things that we hope and think might be possible are to be imagined to be actual there. And when you have imagined everything you can think of as possible to be actual, you discover new types of possibilities to imagine. Fairyland trains the capaciousness of our imaginations, stretching them by giving them, perhaps for the first time, a sufficiently vast canvas on which to paint. Thus, Fairyland schools us to look up, to recognize that we are not at the top of the hierarchy, and to practice living in the shadow of something greater. It is thus able to teach us numinous fear and ecstatic joy. The former, when we feel the anger of the power of such great being, of creatures wild and wonderful who could tear us apart with only their laughter. The latter, when we are ushered into rapturous experiences of wonder and delight that surpass anything on offer on this side of the veil. In this way, Fairyland teaches us to live and think and feel in more fundamentally human ways, setting aside the old farce, as old as history itself, that we can appropriate divine ways for ourselves. But this is not all. Act now, and you also get, we can put the Fae and the spiritual together. Fairyland may not be supernatural, but Tolkien says that it has a mystical face that it turns to the supernatural. In one of its modes, it looks upward to that which is properly above it, gazing in mystical raptness at the high summits of heaven and the yawning infinite abyss of hell. And it is changed by what it gazes on, as are all things. That's the law of seeing, that one is never a mere observer, but is impacted by what one sees. This is as true scientifically as it is metaphysically and spiritually. I've said elsewhere in my On Teaching Fairy Stories that Fairyland is most fundamentally a mirror held up to the world we live in. Its purpose is to show the world to us truly. But in order to be able to show the world truly, it cannot show the world as it is, because the world hides its truth under a false appearance. So if Fairyland is going to hold up a mirror to the world, it will have to be a funhouse mirror, making the world plain by its very distortion. The fault lies not in Fairyland, but in our eyes, which can no longer see straight. Now I must also say that Fairyland is not only a mirror reflecting our world back to us, it is also a mirror refracting the spiritual worlds of heaven and hell. As the bright realm, which is one of Fairyland's names, it shows us ways that heaven might appear to natural minds such as ours. Heaven is not the varied fairy forests, the castles that can only be told of in song, and the streams, the vision of which heals the heart of all its troubles. But it is like them, and it is perhaps more like them than the world we walk in every day. Likewise, as the realm perilous, which is its other name, it shows us the terrible seriousness of the business of living, the awful might and burden of the power of choice, and something of the depths to which failure can sink us. Hell is not the unlocked tower with no sight of the stars from which we nevertheless cannot escape, or the dark well into which we have been cast, broken and bloody, with no hope of escape, or the mirrored halls in which even wary souls can be caught unawares, never to come forth again. But it is like them, and in them we see more clearly just what we risk every time we take our souls into our hands in defiance of the will of the Lord of heaven. And so Fairyland is also a teacher, training us to look beyond itself, beyond the very natural to the supernatural. Only the faintest outline of the borders of the supernatural are visible from there. But my goodness, it is worth seeing. It is no wonder, then, that minds enamored not just of the fantastical but also of heaven, like MacDonald, Tolkien, and Lewis, were drawn to the Fae. And it is no accident that these great Fae apologists are also authors of such beloved tales of fantasy. But above all, it is no accident that they turn to the Fae as that which is peculiarly suited to the communication of spiritual truth. It is not because they were adept at ignoring its character, but because they saw its character so clearly. They saw clearly that the Fae is, as it were, the missing step in the ladder of being, leading our thoughts from the natural to the supernatural. Real if you think it. The last thing I have to say is that none of what I've said before is in the slightest way affected by the reality or lack of reality of Fairyland, in the common way in which we use the term real. I know a quite educated fellow who believes fairies in the realm of the Fae are real. I also know many wise children who believe that. But even if they should be wrong, it does not mean that Fairyland does not occupy the place I have described for it. For I have been speaking not of literal journeys through Fairyland, but intellectual ones. And thoughts prove their reality in their power to direct our actions and reshape the physical world. A power which, far from being less effective than physical power, is much, much more so. This is why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and Paul in very many passages urge us to guard our thoughts. If the goal is an intellectual ascent to God, an intellectual fairyland will serve quite nicely. And if you wish to ascend to God at all, you must do so at least in part in your intellect. For you cannot love what you don't know, even if you will never fully know what you don't love. What is required is a unified heart and mind working in concert towards a common goal. And this, too, is part of what Fairyland can teach us. Indeed, this may be its most urgent message. Let us attend to it faithfully. Thank you. He's just going to get another mic, so students, go ahead and get your questions ready. We teachers really can't look at you all day. We'll just... Awkward, we don't care. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. That was super cool. So I'm a political science global studies double major, and it's kind of related to this, but I was once reading a book about this woman who read Octavia Butler and kind of like sci-fi and how sci-fi can be used kind of as like reimagining our future, and especially when it comes to like social movements and that kind of stuff. And you know, I think like fairies and angels and like what as you were talking about is very like the spiritual realm, but I also come from like the political realm. And how it ties in theology and like my own personal faith and how that kind of like manifests. And I'm very interested in like how the imagination can also impact our like co-creating of the world together, and like our collective imaginations of how that impacts like, you know, the social structures we see, the economic structures we see, and how theological structures also impact our society. And I was wondering if you can touch on that, because I know you mentioned you are also interested in sci-fi as well, but maybe from like, you know, the fairies, angels, however you'd like to take that. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. Yes. Yeah, science fiction, I see science fiction as very closely tied to fantasy literature. And I think it's because they're both concerned primarily with other worlds. And what's really cool that both of them show in their different ways is that other worlds don't have to be literally other worlds than this one, right? What we could become is an other world because it is not the world that we are now. And so therefore the worlds we could make are other worlds. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but there's kind of some crazy stuff going on in the world today, right? I mean, there's like Russia and Ukraine, that's still going on, and Israel's fighting everybody, and this election, really? And the hurricane, and like just nuts stuff. Huge, huge, huge problems are out there in the world, and you guys have got to fix them. Because your teachers, we're out of here, man. We got like a good 20, 30 years left on us, and then we're gone, right? So this is your problem. Have you noticed how inadequate some of the tools we're trying to hand you are to some of the problems you're facing? Right? You're going to have to see things we've never seen before. How are you going to do that? If you spend all your time only thinking the thoughts that have been thought before, why would you expect to have a new thought? To see a possibility that we hadn't seen before? I don't think there's anything more urgent for the world's problems politically, socially, theologically, however you want to, wherever realm you want to look at. I don't think there's anything more important for solving those problems than imagination. And so anything you read that helps to grow your imagination is urgent, and you should take it seriously. Does that get at it? Thanks.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. You referenced J.R.R. Tolkien a few times, and I've read On Fairy Stories here at Providence College. My impression of the work was that he's a little ambiguous as to whether he really believes in, I don't know if reality is the good word, but like the reality of fairies. As you had mentioned in the end of your talk, they can have like an actual reality in nature or an intellectual reality. Which way, in your estimation, do you think Tolkien leans towards? Is it more of an intellectual realm for him, or is it physical? He doesn't really.
It's hard to want to answer that question because I
Yeah.
feel like Tolkien would not want to answer the question. I feel like if he were up here, he would hedge, right? And so, am I betraying him if I put an answer on him? Because I think he's gonna want to. I think he probably would be afraid of what happens if he admits that maybe he doesn't think it's really real. That maybe, especially when he's living in the middle of the 20th century, people are gonna say, "Oh, well, we don't have to worry about it then, right? Castles in the sky, don't worry about it. Let's focus on real stuff, right? The next iPhone." I think he thinks it's more real than people think, but still not literally real. So let me give an example. I have a daughter who's now 8, but when she was in junior kindergarten, so first time going to school, she came home. I said something about unicorns, and she said, "Daddy, my teacher said unicorns aren't real." And I said the first of many times that I will say in my child's life, "Balderdash." And I said, just because you probably, and we can't say for sure, right, because we haven't been everywhere, but just because you probably won't encounter a unicorn in this world doesn't mean they aren't real. That's all I said, and I left it at that. And I didn't say anything to the teacher, who's a very sweet, wonderful woman. But I noticed a couple weeks later, my daughter, she came to me and she says, "Daddy, are bears real in our world?" And I realized, I began to tell from the things she was saying that her teacher's language had shifted to my language. And so my daughter must have said something to the teacher and kind of gotten it across. And I think that's really, really important, right? Because there's a great difference between saying unicorns and dragons aren't real and unicorns and dragons are not running around your neighborhood, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. Okay, so then you can shift your thinking from I don't need to focus on like dragon survival plans, but I can't stop thinking about dragons and what the implications of that are for my world. And I think that's kind of where Tolkien would want us to live.
Thanks so much for your lecture. This doesn't answer Aiden's question completely about whether or not Tolkien believed in real fairies. There's a great story told about him about one time he emptied his pockets in the company of a friend and pulled out a really tiny shoe and said, "This is the shoe of a fairy." I know it. Anyway, it's a great story.
He was a great jokester.
At the end of his life, Tolkien wrote Smith of Booton Major, his last published story. And he wrote a little essay about that story in which he says that the essence of Fairyland is love. And what it really does is teach you the love of love and the love of beautiful things. And I mention this because there's much we can learn from Fairyland, the expansion of the imagination, the political implications, the looking towards the supernatural. But as best I can tell, for Tolkien, the essence of Fairyland was the appreciation of things for their own sakes. And that's not exactly the road to heaven or the road to hell. It's something else. It's like a rest in the beautiful. And that's both exhilarating and dangerous if we linger too long. So I'm just curious what you think about that. It might just be exactly what you are thinking in your presentation, but I thought I would formulate it that way and invite your comments.
That's good. I was focusing in this talk on the trajectory of Fairyland, but he's right. And one of the other great fairy apologists, G.K. Chesterton, wrote a whole book called Tremendous Trifles. It actually was a column that he had in a newspaper for a while. And the conceit is it's a bunch of essays about little things like, what have I got in my pockets? And his belief, he opens the whole thing with this fairy tale about two brothers who walked out into their little, front London yard, which is about as big as this podium, one day, and a mailman was passing by and asked them if they wouldn't like to make a wish. And one of the brothers wished to be very, very big, and the other wished to be very, very small. And the mailman was, of course, a fairy, and so he granted their wishes. And the one who got really big decided to go all over the world and see all the things there were to see. So he goes to Niagara Falls, and it's like a little puddle. And he goes to the Grand Canyon, and it's like a little crack in the ground. And like nothing is cool and he gets exhausted and weary, and he lies down in the field, and a farmer comes out of his house and sees this giant lying down in his field, and he's just happened to have been reading his manual of moral theology, and he sees that evil is disproportionate to the world, and so he sees this giant monster, and he cuts its head off, and that's the end of that kid. The other kid discovers a world of wonders in the tiny little garden of his front yard and is still exploring it to this day. And what that tale is meant to show you is that you don't have to go all over the world to find wonders. They're right there where you are. And everything will reveal its magical nature to you if you pay attention to it. But our problem is that we don't, right? We rush past things to the next thing. So I think that's absolutely right. I deeply agree with that notion in Tolkien. And it's about, for me, the way I avoid doing something like what I take St. Augustine to do, which is to say, creation is a ladder to the spiritual, and once you get up to God, you can kick the ladder away. Right? Whether or not Augustine said that, there's certainly plenty of folks who did say that, Desert Fathers, for instance. The way I avoid that, and the way I think that, in a way that I think Tolkien would appreciate, is to say, it's not that I have to stop seeing the individual wonders to see the Lord of wonders. It is by seeing the individual wonder that each thing and each person is that I come to see the Lord of wonders, and a kind of co-seeing.
About the nature of the natural versus the supernatural. You mentioned a lot about how Fairyland is hypernatural. It's a mirror of kind of the fullness of what we have on Earth, and how we can use that to train our imaginations to make us better. I kind of wanted to ask that, given the context of how a lot of the ancient stories of fairies show them as more malevolent, at best of dubious moral character, at worst actively evil, does that potentially speak to a level of danger in exploring the hypernatural, or do you think it's more of a purely edifying thing?
Oh no, if it's dangerous. It is absolutely. It won't do to forget that Fairyland is both the bright realm and the realm perilous. If you're not up for dragons and ogres and monsters and evil women and things like that, don't go to Fairyland. Definitely don't do that. But also don't go outside. Just go home and lock yourself in your room and just stay there. Right? You just have Uber Eats bring you food, and just don't talk to anybody, for God's sake. Stay off the internet, right? Just because there's only one thing more dangerous than the world, and that's your thoughts. But if, on the other hand, you'd like to live a human life, then you're going to have to think. You're going to have to face the demons in your thoughts. And you're going to have to go out into the world, and you're going to face dragons and all sorts of sea monsters and whatever else there might be, right? Fairyland's a mirror for the world, the whole world. The good parts and the bad parts. The parts that still reflect the original goodness that God put into it, and the parts that are so twisted by human sin that it seems impossible to believe there could be any goodness left in it, right? So it's dangerous business stepping outside your door, Frodo.
From your talk, I gathered that the Fairyland and fairies are very much, the idea is very much enmeshed with Christianity. So it's either sort of in opposition to it, or it's related to it somehow, or maybe it leads us down past where we can see the sacramentality of nature and glimpses of God and so forth. I'm just wondering about, would you say that the idea of fairies is kind of a Christian thing? I mean, in other cultures, say, of course, they have spirits that live in trees and ancestor spirits and things like that, but would you call those ideas like fairy? Are they Fairyland too, or is it mostly a Christian thing?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it Christian. I do think that historically it is a holdover from the pre-Christian religion of Germanic peoples, Germanic and Celtic peoples. And it's stronger among the Celtic peoples than it is among the Germanic peoples. And so you see it more in Ireland and Scotland, Brittany, places like this, Wales. But it's there in Germanic peoples too, and it's a very strong tradition in Germanic peoples. I do think there's a commonality to all of the to all of these traditions of nature spirits, powers and places, that kind of a thing, I would be comfortable folding other cultures' images into a fairyland tale. But properly speaking, it's marked by its historical emergence. And so, properly speaking, I preserve the word fairy for this particular corner of the world in Northern Europe. But I think what's interesting is, so these things, it's like they didn't have, fairies didn't exist in folklore until Christianity came along. And so it's not that they're just what people believed in before Christianity came, and then it's like, oh, we don't want to let go of the fairies, those are fun stories. But it's rather that somehow the encounter between the pagan pre-culture and the Christian culture produced fairies. It was a way of coping with letting go of the old feelings, but either through lack of catechesis or through lack of specific theological development in this area where you were, intuitions about the world that were well gathered up by those old pagan sources weren't being reflected in the Christian ways, and so the fairies were a way of bringing those intuitions forward, right? So it's a bit of a yes and no. Technically, I would say no, but I do think that the fairy as such, historically comes about in the encounter between paganism and Christianity, and so perhaps doesn't come about apart from Christianity.
It's interesting that the figures that you pointed to, many of the figures that you pointed to, all were on the Isles in the late 19th and early 20th century. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts as to why, in that particular moment in history, in that particular culture, this reappropriation or transformation or just different approach to Fairyland might have arisen?
Yeah. Excuse me. Partly, I think it's because there was actually a really intense Victorian interest in fairies. There was all sorts of fairy poetry being written, and that's when they went from being dangerous to being Tinkerbell. And you see, like, if you read J.M. Barrie, what was it called? The White Lotus or something like that. It's the novel in which Peter Pan first appears, and he's not the Peter Pan that we know. The fairies are getting cutified, but there's still an edge to them and a danger to them. You've got to be careful about them, right? So I think part of this, and so I think partly in response to that, Yeats is like, that's not the tradition. Like, we need to get back. And so Yeats goes around Ireland gathering all the tales of fairy that he can find, and he publishes a book called Fairy and Folk Tales of Ireland. And a lot of them are stories that he heard in pubs as he heard them. And the people telling these stories to him, in many cases, believed them. So he brings that forward. Now, pretty much everybody that I named, that I cited from that period you're guessing, these guys were all heavily influenced by Yeats. And so he puts this back in their imaginations in a new sort of way. There was also a novel written by Lord Dunsany. If you've never heard of Lord Dunsany, it's not a flaw in your education. He's very, very unknown these days, but look him up. This guy was incredible. He was a British peer. He wrote about 60 novels. He had plays on Broadway. I mean, he was like everything, right? He was like the Lin-Manuel Miranda of the 19th century. And he wrote a novel called The King of Elfland's Daughter, which both Tolkien and Lewis loved. And in that, you're seeing the same thing that Lewis said that he learned from David Lindsay about science fiction. He says, I learned what stories of other worlds were good for. They were good for spiritual journeys, right? And I think that people like MacDonald and Chesterton, who are the ancestors of Lewis and Tolkien, they were seeing that same thing. They were catching that from these guys, and they got that going. And then that begins a tradition that is centered in the Isles. But, there's, MacDonald will quote, in Fantastes, MacDonald will quote Novalis, who's a German writer, and he's got the same idea. And he's talking about, he's working through the German fairy tales on the similar notions. So it's probably part of the romantic response to industrialism as well. Yeah.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Okay.
Depending on how long they are. I can give shorter answers and leave more space if.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the perspectives. Backing up a little bit to the Renaissance, where would you, or what is your takeaway from Shakespeare's fairy world in A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's cool because he's a lot closer to these things, and he's introducing some stuff we haven't seen before. We don't have an attestation of the name Queen Mab before Shakespeare, right? So that's an interesting connection there, and then how she factors in later on is very interesting. So it's kind of funny because the Renaissance is looking at itself as this time when they're emerging from medieval superstitions, right? The notion of Middle Ages is starting to be created in the Renaissance to describe the thing that they're not and that they're better than, right? And so they're creating this false Dark Ages other to refer to. And so they're looking back on all of this stuff that people have been, stories they've grown up with and their grandmothers told them and this sort of things. And there's like, yeah, that's that superstition stuff. And we are explorers, and we're getting out there and we're seeing the world, and we've been to America, and there were no dragons there, and these sorts of things. And so Shakespeare represents one of the earliest instances of a literary reflectiveness on this tradition, which is now holding it a bit at arm's length and thinking about what it can do with it in that sort of a way. And so I find it really fascinating because it's that transition period between we actually believe this to these are really fun stories. Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned that most the fairy tradition originates in like Northern Europe. Is there a sort of necessary geography or climate in which this takes place? Like, if I'm born and raised in San Diego or Cabo San Lucas, it's like, no, there's clearly no fairies. It's like 80 degrees and sunny every day. Like, do you need like the dark nights, the storms, and the deep woods and stuff?
That's right. Yeah, Californians have never yet invented anything interesting. No, sorry, just kidding. Yeah, I love California. Gosh, I'm a philosopher, and so I don't like to say like necessity is a big word for me. But I'm just going to retreat to history and say that I think it was. Well, I'll say this. I'll say it was greatly fitting, right? Conveniens erat, because. Think about, you've got the moor. The fairies are very often associated with the moor. Even more so than forests, they were originally associated with moors. And moors are these big flat areas that have got bogs in them, and they've got these like weird like gorse. It's really easy to lose your way. They're trackless, right? And it all looks the same for as far as the eye can see. And you're walking on these things, and there are the fairy lights, the will-o'-the-wisps, which is usually methane coming up from the swamp. And so if you follow it, you're going to fall into the bog that it's coming out of, and you're going to die. Don't follow the lights. And you've got weird sounds as the wind's whistling through weird things. And just being out there, living up on the moor, watching the sheep and goats eat all day, just starts to do stuff to your brain, right? It's a lonely sort of place. And then there's the long nights, the importance of midwinter and midsummer up there. Midsummer's Eve is almost daytime. And midwinter's night, it's like almost night forever, right? The days are so long, the nights are so long. So I think all these things did exert a kind of pressure on the human imagination that pushed it in certain numinous and supernatural directions.
Let's give a thunderous ovation. Dr. Junius Johnson.
Thank you all.
And remember to waltz on down the hall to the reception.